They told me everyone was going to be dressed up. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. If this is your first day, welcome to the Main Street Summit. If you're returning, we are so thrilled that you're here today. So, we are not slowing down. I've been asking everyone that I see in the hallway and walking in and even in the hotel this morning, what's your favorite part? What are you enjoying the most? What have you learned? And I've heard two really loud themes. One is the conference experience itself, the organization, how it's streamlined. Every detail has been considered. And so will you please join me in giving a really loud 8 a.m. clap for the team at the Department of Commerce who's put this together. That's you guys in the hallway. This is for you. Awesome. The other really loud theme that was a little bit surprising to me, because I would call it an unintended benefit, was this. There was all this great substance so far, a lot of learning, but I heard from so many people that it is just awesome to be around people that love North Dakota like I do and that care about creating great communities. And I hope that we can carry that past today, because we are here for each other. So, couple housekeeping details. There is going to be a haunted fort, and you can see the registration desk. There's a discount code available at the registration desk. And please, please don't forget to do your session evaluations. They really do matter. They're going to help us continue to improve as we work towards the very next Main Street Summit. So, with that, as a self-professed data geek, and a person who really appreciates a good sense of humor, I am so excited for our next speaker. Ben Winchester has been working both in and for small towns across the Midwest for over 20 years. He lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota with his wife and 2 children. He is trained as a rural sociologist, and he works as a senior research fellow for the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. He conducts applied research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding a theme of rewriting the rural narrative that's vital to rural America. Ben received his undergraduate degree in math and statistics from the University of Minnesota Morris and a master's degree in rural sociology from the University of Missouri, Columbia. He was a founding employee at the Center for Small Towns, an outreach and engagement program at the University of Minnesota Morris, and specializes in community development, demographic analysis, data visualization, and moving communities away from anecdata. And Ben will explain what that word means in just a moment. Please join me in welcoming Ben this morning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben. You heard I'm a research fellow. I work for University of Minnesota Extension. I think you all know Extension is the 4-H people, right? I'm not in 4-H. I wasn't in 4-H. But in many ways, I work in an extension sliver that reflects the modern rural that we've got today. And we call that center Community Vitality. Lynette Flage is here from North Dakota Extension. She is also a colleague of mine and has worked to better. Where is Lynette? I do not see her out there. Right there. Just really kudos to Lynette for everything she's done over the years to help rural communities prosper across North Dakota and all the work she's done for Extension. Thank you. So you see the title of the presentation here is Rewriting the Rural Narrative. Kind of the premise that I have before y'all is that the narrative that we use to describe our rural communities is inherently negative. It's really not very positive. It's based on, historical things that have happened in our rural communities and really doesn't help us inform the communities that we have today. So the subtitle, as you see, is Speak Softly, or maybe you don't see, oh yeah, there we go, is Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. I'm a data geek. I love data, but I know many of you don't. So hopefully everything you hear today will be consumable and understandable. As Michelle mentioned, I did my undergraduate work at the University of Minnesota Morris, and during my time there, doing my undergrad work in math and stats, during my time there, I started to realize how easy it was to get involved in small towns. And now Morris is a town of 5,000 people, and at the time, this was one of the smallest towns I'd ever really lived in. And I had grown up in Winona, Minnesota in Southeast, which was like 30,000 people. I get to Morris and I was like, holy cow, this is a small town. And then I realized pretty quickly, like, Morris is a good sized town. Like 85% of the towns in Minnesota have less than 2,500 people. So for every time you hear of a town that's got a newspaper or a radio station, there's probably 30 to 50 other towns you never hear about across the state. So I started to think more about, like, could I really envision a future for myself? And as I got more involved in Morris life, I realized how easy it was to get involved in the Eagles, the Red Cross, and just, help improve these civic groups in ways that I could have never imagined being done in Winona, even, which was, again, not a large metro, but still it takes work to get things done there. So I started to do work, and I realized pretty quickly that as I engaged faculty in doing research and working for a group like, we have West Central Initiative and Initiative Foundation, which does community betterment work in western Minnesota. They needed an update to their economic data. So faculty said, hey, Ben, I know you kind of want to do this small town rural thing. You want to update this data. And I was like, for who now? This Initiative Foundation? Who are all these groups? Like, there's initiative foundations, rural development commissions. We've got the Bush Foundation, McKnight, the Northwest Area Foundation. Like, we've got all of these groups that work in and for small towns. But as a student, I thought, when I graduate, I'm going to get a job for a private company somewhere. But this made me realize there's a whole industry that serves rural America, that works in and for small towns. It's actually very large. And it was unknown to me at the time, but I started to look across the landscape, and I was looking for opportunity because I did not want to move to Minneapolis-St. Paul. And so what were my options? And one day, Roger McCannon, who is the head of continuing education at the University of Minnesota Morris, called me and said, Ben, I know you want to do this rural thing. We are starting this organization called the Center for Small Towns. We want you to be the first employee. And I was like, right on, because I was bar manager at the Eagles at the time, and I didn't really want to do that for very long. I was on the board, and I just helped out as our manager left. So I started to do this work at the Center for Small Towns. And I worked with small towns, mostly in western Minnesota, and started to do more statewide work. And it was at that time I started to realize there's a fairly common negative narrative out there about rural communities. So again, like, I want to learn more about rural communities. I felt like I didn't know enough. I started to read books and read articles. And what do I see? I see headlines like, people keep leaving rural America. Small towns are playing a role in their own demise. We'll talk about that in a minute. Rural Minnesota's in trouble. Like, all of these things were pretty bad. And in fact, I was like, what about these books? And I look at books, and there's like The Decline of Rural Minnesota, Fighting for the American Countryside, Survival of Rural America. Almost all of these are stories of struggle, loss, doom, gloom, decline. And at the time, I thought, what am I doing? Why do I want to work in an industry to help towns die, right? Like, am I going to be a critical care assistant that I want to make sure they go out in a respectful way? Like, I know you're going down pretty soon, but all right. But meanwhile, this wasn't what I was seeing on the ground. On the ground, I saw vitality. On the ground, I saw communities, helping to improve their places. I saw people still wanting small town life to succeed. So again, the narrative was overwhelmingly negative, but on the ground, I wasn't hearing that story. And this narrative is fairly common. There's a brain drain, and the brain drain, we hear this, we've got books and stacks of journal articles that talk about the brain drain, and if you don't know, the brain drain is when you lose your 18-year-olds. They graduate from high school, and they leave, right? And this apparently is a huge problem. I think there was one of the books here is called Hollowing Out the Middle, and it's the rural brain drain and what it means for rural America. And that book was written by a couple of sociologists like me who spent years in Iowa and looked at how the school district there was encouraging its young people to leave. And this was apparently a big problem, right? But, what are you going to tell your 18-year-olds they can't leave? You want to build up more resentment in your 18-year-olds? Tell them they can't leave town when they graduate, okay? So really, we've got this brain drain. We live in the middle of nowhere, right? How many of you all said that in the past? Like, where do you live? I live in the middle of nowhere. Because you don't want to say where you live, because people don't know where that is, right? People ask me, I lived in Hancock for 12 years. When people would ask where I lived, I'd be like, Hancock, and they'd stare like they have no idea. And I'd say Morris, and they stare blankly, and they'll be like, Alexandria, and they're like, right? It's like, west of St. Cloud, an hour and a half. And they're like, oh, okay, right? We're in the middle of nowhere. We're a sleepy town. This one's especially popular in articles, media articles especially, that look at towns that were like woken up by the murder. Like, right, in a small town, you were all sleeping until something happened, apparently, right? Everybody knows one another. You don't. Nobody locks their doors. You do, right? And this narrative is based on what we had, what we could have had, what we should have had. I go to so many towns that have this narrative of opportunity lost. I remember 40 years ago, we would have had 3M in our town if it weren't for the council, if they would have just rezoned that land north of the highway, right? How many towns have this story of opportunity lost? And I argue now, why do we have these stories like in our back pocket? We got these negative narrative things in our back pocket that we pull out all the time. I argue the reason why we have these negative narratives, that we have these stories of opportunities lost, because we don't believe where we are is where we should be. We're not happy with where we are because we're not so-and-so, or that town has this, right? And we're never happy with where we are. So meanwhile, again, as I mentioned, we have this kind of deficit approach to rural communities. And at the time, I was like, I don't want to help small towns die. I want to help them get better. I want to help them improve. And so I want to introduce a term to you called anecdata. Anecdata is information which is presented as if it's based on serious research, when in fact it's based on what somebody thinks is true. We are filled with anecdotes, right? You see anecdote in there, right? It's anecdote data. But the plural of anecdote is not trend, right? You get 3 or 4 people sitting around a coffee table that talk about how terrible your town is. That's not a trend. That's a group of people that don't like your town for whatever reason, and that should not dominate the narrative, though many times those voices are very loud. Many times those voices have leadership positions, right? And how do you counter that when you don't have a loud enough voice to counteract that? And it's even worse when you don't have data, when you don't have information to actually counter this narrative that's out there. So, I don't want to dissuade you from the fact that we've gone through tremendous changes in this country, in our rural communities. The early 1900s, the mechanization of agriculture alone reduced the number of farm workers in this country by 20 to 80%, depending on what type of industry you were in. So you started to see a depopulation of our rural communities across, all over in the country. We started to see roads and transportation systems grow, and I comically say at this point we went from Little House on the Prairie to not Little House on the Prairie in about 12 years. You go from horse and buggy to a car now, and I tell this story like, you know, right, the Ingalls, they lived in Walnut Grove, and when they needed to go to their doctor's appointment in Mankato, it would take them a day to get there. Right, they horse and wagon, they get there, and you might as well spend 2 or 3 days there because it took you a day to get there, so you spent 2 or 3 days. And the one doctor's appointment now took 5 days. You went from Little House on the Prairie to now I can be to the doctor and back in a day or less than a day. So this changed everything with regards to not only how small towns saw themselves, but how they connected to each other. Because now you didn't just live and work and shop and play in your town. Now you could go to your neighboring town, and you could go to 2 or 3 towns over. And it's during this time frame in the early 1900s we started to see the rise of regional centers. And these started to build an economic situation where not every town was going to win in this race for urbanity or this race for regional centers. Also during this time frame, we had educational achievement start to really ramp up. More people started to get their high school degrees, and in fact, more people started to get college degrees. The GI Bill afforded an opportunity for rural residents, many times for the first time ever in their family, to get a college degree and bring that back home. This is transformative. We know that human capital builds social capital and builds all of these other capitals. It starts with human capital, educational achievement. We have done very well educating our people in our rural communities. So now we start to see, again, we have things like churches closed too. And now it's during this time frame, churches closed not because people weren't going to church, it's because the Lutherans moved in, right? We're not all Catholics in town. And like, you know, you start to go through these changes in your town that demark, you know, changes in narrative, and that our town doesn't look like it used to. From 1950 and on, we see even more changes that negatively impact our small towns. Main Street restructuring, this is a very kind economist way of saying businesses closed. Hardware stores, grocery stores, apothecaries, right? You can't have 3 gas stations in town now. Now you're down to 1. And what do we have in our small towns left? We have boarded up buildings. And this impacts that narrative pretty heavily. In fact, you probably, in many cases, have boarded up buildings that still exist, right? In Hancock, we had a bank building that sat empty for years. And then literally like 2 years after I moved into Hancock, so I went to graduate school at the University of Missouri. I was in Morris. I went to graduate school in Missouri after the Red River flood in '97 and came back to the Center for Small Towns in 2002. And it was during that time that I moved to Hancock, and I realized this was pretty nice. We had a full K-12 school. We had Buddy's Bar and Grill. It was a nice small town, and the house I bought was across the street from the school. And one day, they had a grocery store, and like week 2, I walk into the grocery store, and there's literally 2 loaves of bread on the shelf. And I asked the owner, and I asked her, and she said, well, we're closing up. I was like, dang, now I got to go shopping in Morris, right? Which is where I worked, and that was fine, but I would have much rather been able to, obviously, get groceries in Hancock. But this is, again, part of the changes that we see in our rural communities that in many ways seem like nails in the coffin, right? Oh, that's just one more nail in the coffin of our town. We're just dying out, right? And now we talk about school consolidations, too. Now, school consolidations in the 80s and 90s was kind of our heyday of consolidation. Like there's a lot of hand-wringing at the time. Just like with closing your hardware store or your grocery store, the hand-wringing is like, oh, I should have shopped there more. I knew I should have shopped there more. And that would have saved us. It wouldn't, right? School consolidations too. At the time, there's a lot of hand-wringing, like, oh, if it wasn't for open enrollment, or if it wasn't for private schools, right? It's all false. The number one reason why your school is consolidated was the birth rate. When your outgoing class of seniors is 20 kids and your incoming class is 16, this has a negative impact on that cohort through its life of the school district. And so now, this actually is something you have control over. You want to do something about your low birth rate, start having pro-fertility days in your small towns, and bump up your birth rates. You have control over this. Main Street restructuring, you don't. When you close hardware stores and grocery stores, they're closing because of economic dynamics that impact everybody. This is called globalization. This is called living in the modern world. And of course, we start to think again that our small town is dying when these changes happen because, right, what do we have left? What do we have left? But I'll remind you that every time you hear of a hardware store closing in Cavalier, where are the Cavalier folks? Oh, right. Hi. I was in Cavalier a couple years ago. Every time you hear of a hardware store closing in Cavalier, not that one did, I want to remind you that one closed in Bismarck too. One closed in Fargo, one closed in Moorhead, right? These are the impacts of globalization. It happens everywhere. But if something closes in your small town, it's probably your only one. But if something closes in the metro, they got 3 to 5 other options, many times within walking or driving distance, right? But you close your only grocery store, you have to drive past that every day and remind yourself of what you used to be and what you could have had or should have had, right? You fall right back into the negative narrative that this town just took a right turn into the ditch, and we're going to continue this. So we now have hospitals closing, right? All of these dynamics are based on decisions that we rarely have control over, but they are the impacts of living in the modern world. So we really do have this idyllic view of what rural is in this country. And, you know, like when I lived in Hancock, I drove to Morris every day. It was like corn and soybeans, corn and soybeans, corn and soybeans. It's really easy to think that we are an agricultural economy, but the economy of rural America is well past an agricultural-only economy. It's well past a manufacturing-only economy. I mean, you have some boom towns and things. I know y'all do here. But that's not, those are the anomalies. They're the exceptions. They're not the rule to economic life in rural America. So meanwhile, we've got these changes in our rural economy too. The top industries in rural America today are education and health services, by far. They make a third of all your jobs today. Agriculture is no longer the mainstay, but still has its role. Manufacturing is no longer the mainstay, but still has its role. So now when we think about this, we need to appreciate the diversity of the economy that we've got. Because again, when we are a mono industry, you are so much more subject to the whims of the economy, right? You know farm income goes like this every year. You do not want to base your Main Street sales or retail success on an industry that has that type of volatility. And at the same time, we have diversified ourselves, and we'll look at some of that in a minute. So I did the McKnight Foundation had commissioned the Center for Small Towns to do a study of how do the metropolitan media in Minnesota portray rural Minnesota. So we looked at the Star Tribune, the Pioneer Press, a couple other different sources out there, and we asked students to kind of code all these stories over the course of the past 3 years, and what kind of stories were covered, you know, where were they actually located. I mean, it was, you want to read the report, it's interesting. It's on the centerforsmalltowns.org website. But I mean, there were troubling pieces too, but a lot of things were stereotypes about rural. But one of the things I did was I asked reporters, what time of day did you go to Cavalier? We'll say, what time of day did you go to Cavalier? What time of day did you go to Grafton, right? And the average time of day that reporters got out from the Minneapolis Twin Cities Metro was between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. is the time they visited our small towns, right? Well, who are you going to find in your small towns today, right? You're not going to find, right? This picture, Sleepy Eye, that picture in the upper right corner, I think is the idyllic view of what people expect to find. This Norman Rockwellish approach to trying to understand rural doesn't help us, actually. But this is Sleepy Eye, Minnesota from the early 1900s, right? And this is what I think people want to see when they go to a small town is a filled main street and people walking everywhere, right? Well, today, the economic function of our small towns is very different. You have people commuting out, and the small towns don't look like this, but meanwhile, when the reporters show up in town, what do they find? Not many people walking around, certainly not cars like filling our main streets, and they may even see boarded up buildings or even boarded up schools. And in many ways, it reaffirms the stereotype and the bias that is inherent in understanding rural today, in that small towns are dying. Like, yep, there's the boarded up school, and there's the old grocery store, and there's the old post office, right? Or whatever it is. And in many ways, it reaffirms the notion that rural is dying. So anyway, what's the reporter do then? After not finding a lot of people in town, you go to the cafe or the C-store or whatever it is, and who do you find in the cafe? All the retired farmers who talk about how life used to be. And that is the narrative. And this is how it propagates itself. So meanwhile, recently we've had discussions about post offices closing too. And of course, one of the major metro newspapers sent a reporter up to Calumet, Minnesota, which is just west of Duluth. And of course, like, people love talking to reporters. They'll give them quotes or whatever. So the reporter went in and wanted to better understand, like, what's going to be the impact of closing this post office on the community? What's going to be the impact? And of course, what the reporter gets are tons of quotes, and what ends up in the newspaper is a very distilled version of this whole community narrative that exists. But meanwhile, here's what was in the newspaper, is Iron Range Town fighting for more than the mail up there on top, right? And then the subtitle is Calumet challenges the decision to close its post office, which is a social hub for its residents. And I was like, social hub? I never hung out in the post office in Hancock. Like, there's no coffee and rolls there. And this is funny until you think of how many people just read this. 750,000 people just read this, that now think that you're hanging out in your post office. This is the kind of narrative that can dismiss rural America. This is the kind of narrative that we are up against when we are actually trying to talk positively about our small towns. So meanwhile, the point here is rural's changing. It's not dying. We're going to talk about why it's not dying in specifics here. But in many ways, I love small towns, especially because we're microcosms of globalization. You want to understand how the world is changing? Look to small towns, because it happens here first. You know, we're not this disconnected world, right, Little House on the Prairie. Like, when change happens in the world then, it does take time to trickle to Walnut Grove. But today, we are immediately impacted by trends that happen across the world. So now, when you see changes happen in your small town, you're not alone. It is every town that these changes occur in. But more importantly, we tend to see the narrative around rural change because, with every one of these major negative changes, the hardware store closes, our small town's going to die. If we lose our school, our small town's going to die. If we lose our grocery, show me all the dead towns. They're not around. And why not? They're still here for good reason, because people love to live in our small towns. Why is it so hard to find a house for sale? If all our small towns are dead, why can't I find a place to buy? Right? None of this makes sense. This negative narrative really doesn't make sense. So what's been going on? Oh, just one more thing here too. I want to remind you that we've gone through all of these changes in rural America and managed all these changes with volunteers. right? You don't have big paid staffs to deal with school consolidation, or your school boards are volunteer, your chambers are volunteer boards, right? We've got nonprofit groups left and right that are helping to improve our rural communities. We're still here because we have volunteered ourselves to ensure the future of our community is going to be viable. So I just want you all to pat not just yourselves, but everybody in your town on their back for still being here, right? So what's been going on in rural America? Since 1970, the rural population has not gone down, it's gone up. It's gone up by 11%. What's gone down is a relative percentage of Americans that live in small towns and rural places. So in 1970, about what, 26%, 1 in 4 people lived in rural America. But by 2010, we're down to 1 in 5, right? Well, how can that be? I thought the rural population went up, right? So the red part of the pie is the rural part, the blue part is the urban part, or the non-metro part, and essentially the pie got bigger, right? There's more people in the country. Even the red part, the rural part, got bigger, but the red part got bigger slower than the blue part did. So while the rural growth rate is 11%, the urban growth rate was 50%. So that leads to a relative percentage decline of rural residents. But almost always you see the 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 is the headline. People prefer living in urban places is almost always the headline you see, and that's not true. Sorry we're not growing as fast as the metro, but in fact, there's another trend at play here. Many of our rural communities have become so successful, they become urbanized. Think about this. How many counties were rural in 1974 that are now considered urban, especially around urban fringes? You've got 181,000 people in North Dakota that now reside in places that were rural 40 years ago. So your real population change for our rural counties is more like 24% in North Dakota. But what happens to my data then, right? So what happens, this is a classification issue. The Economic Research Service and USDA, and the Census Bureau, they get together to figure out how to classify counties and places into urban and rural places. Well, once you hit population thresholds, and once you start hitting commuting patterns, you start to get thrown into this urban status. So really what happens in like Blue Earth County in Minnesota, which is where Mankato is, more recently got classified as urban. Well, what happened now to the rural data? It looks like we just lost 60,000 people. And it looks like urban just gained 60,000 people. And when you recalculate home values, it looks like our home values went down because they had higher home values in that county, right? So it continually looks like doom and gloom for rural because you keep taking the best away from us. Twin Cities metro area, it used to be 40 years ago, we used to say the 7-county metro. It was 7 counties. Today it's like 14. It is not that people, this has been the trend in every metropolitan area in this country, is from the early 1900s, you had a core metropolitan area, but then people were like, I don't want to live in the city central, I want to move out to the country, I want to live in small towns and rural places. So they move out and create the first ring suburbs. Then by the 70s and 80s, the folks that are living in the central city are like, well, I want to move out to more rural place and small town, and they get to the first ring suburbs, and they're like, well, that's not rural. That's urban. So they move out to the second ring suburbs. This is called the concentric ring growth around every urban area in this country, and you have all experienced it. So there's one last term I want to introduce you to. It's total population infatuation. And this is, you know, the sign outside of town that's got your population on it. And when the new census comes out next year, right, you're going to get a new sign. And is your population going to go up or is it going to go down? That's the big question, because if it goes up, you're a winner. If it goes down, you're a big loser. The counties in white here show total population change from 2000 to 2010. If your county is white, you're a loser. If your county is a gradation of yellow-orange, you're a winner because your population went up. But here's why I want you to never use total population as an indicator for your success or failure. Here was a 5-county region in Minnesota where I first was like, wait a minute. And what I found in this 5-county area, non-metropolitan area, remote rural location, is that the population in this 5-county area went from about 70,000 people to what, 45,000 people. They lost 35% of their population. Like huge losers, right? But the number of occupied households went up by 3.5%. How can that be? Average household size has continued to decline. birth rates go down. You know, I mean, if you're in the early 1900s, you're averaging like 3 kids, right? And that's down to 2 kids, and now it's like 1.6 kids, right? Average household size in 1940 was 3.6 people. So if you have 100 homes in your town, that's home to 360 people. Well, today, the average household size is 2.6. So those same 100 homes are now only going to be home to 260 people. That is not people all moving away. This is a function of average household size only. You are going to lose 29% of your population by doing nothing except existing in the modern world, right? Also, at the same time, we see this trend very commonly as you may have 2 seniors in a household. This is that middle chart there. You may have 2 seniors in the household. One of them passes away. The surviving spouse stays in the house. What happened to your population? Just went down by 1. What happened to your occupied housing units? Stayed flat, right? Because that person stayed in the house. Another situation you end up in is you've got a family with 2 kids, and the 2 kids graduate in these time frames. Now what happened? Your total population went down by 2, but your occupied household stayed the same because those kids didn't own the home. If you are so infatuated with total population, I'll tell you what kind of strategy you should have. The moment the Winchester family has the 2 kids graduate, you're going to ask the parents, Bill and Sherry, do you mind if I have these 2 strangers move into your house? Because I don't want to lose population at this point. Right? You don't do this. This is called living in a modern world. Now, so here's a couple counties here. Again, the disconnect here between population change and household change. McIntosh County lost 17% of your population from 2000 to 2010, but the number of housing units stayed the same. Sheridan lost 23% of your population, but the number of occupied housing units only went down by 3%. Your changes are dominated by changes in household structure, not changes in people fleeing away from your towns. So please be cautious when you interpret your total population data. So, early on in my career, I ran across this one data set that showed me the percentage of people that move every 5 years. And here in North Dakota, same as in Minnesota, 46% of households move every 5 years. Now, they can move across town, or they can move to a neighboring town or a neighboring county or to China, right? But the point is, we're a highly mobile population. So I wanted to better understand, like, who's really moving in and who's really moving out, because our total population number tells you nothing about who's actually moving in and who's moving out. So this was one of the first charts I made. This is Grant County, Minnesota. Their population, the bars in red in the upper left, between 90, this was the first chart in the year 2002 that I made. So this is 90 to 2000 data. And the chart shows here that their population in Grant County was pretty flat, right? And if you would ask Muriel Kruzmark there, she'd be like, nobody ever really moves in or out. But like 46% of households are moving, so somebody's moving in, somebody's moving out, right? So what you see is if the bar chart, the gold bars now in this chart by age, it goes from the youngest on the bottom to the oldest at the top, not the oldest, because what I'm doing is I'm looking at how many people were in an age group 10 years ago and how many people are in that 10-year age group 10 years later. So if 5 of you were 10 years old today, then in 10 years, though 5 of you would be 20 years old, right? You get older. But now, if nobody ever moved in or out, you would have the same 5 people. You know, you were 10 years, you're 10 years old today, you're 11 years old tomorrow, and it's the same 5 people. But this is the cohort approach. I want to study groups of people and how many people are in the age group when you compare the 2 groups from one year to the next. And what you see is if the bar chart goes to the right, that means that age group got bigger. It may be hard to see those age numbers, but starting at the bottom are 10 to 14. 10 to 14-year-old cohort got bigger. 10 years ago, they were 0 to 4 years old. Now they're 10 to 14. That cohort got 11% bigger. There were 30 the other bars going to the left now are the 15 to 19 up through 29 years old. This is the brain drain. These are graduates leaving. 40 to 60% of your high school graduates leave, or of your high school kids leave after graduation. So now I started to see this trend of the bars going to the right. The bars going to the right indicate people are moving in these age groups. So 30 to 34, 35 to 39, 40 to 44, all the way up through the 60s. I was like, what is going on here? Like, there's actually positive migration into our rural communities in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And you see the growth in 10 to 14-year-olds. They're not moving alone. 10 to 14-year-olds are moving with their parents. They're, again, in their 30s and 40s. And we found that this trend was very common. When you look across the rural prairie counties, this is a very typical profile. You've got 30, 40, 50-year-olds moving in, they're bringing their kids, and you've got your high school graduates leaving. Recreational counties, they've got population boons, they've got even greater population growth, but just because you're in a pretty landscape doesn't mean the kids don't want to get out. Here's a core metropolitan area. This is true for every core metro in the country except for Los Angeles. Where do the kids go? Right, the bar goes to the right there, up through the age of 30. But more importantly, after the age of 30, folks don't stay in the core metro. But I think there's a common idea out there that our metros are giant sucking sounds and everybody wants to live there. But what we find is there's really specifically 3 age groups that are attracted to core metros, and outside of that, people start to make residential decisions that move out of there. So I called a colleague, Randy Cantrell at the University of Nebraska, and I asked Randy, you know, we got these 30, 40, 50-year-olds moving into rural communities, even in Nebraska where your total population in these counties is going down by 10 to 15%. We've got 30, 40, 50-year-olds moving in. Maybe we should do a study. So we did, because we're academics, right? So we do focus groups and interviews and all these ways to find newcomers. And it was hard at first to find newcomers because it's hard to find newcomers in modern rural life today because we don't have these, Ray Oldenburg called them third places, which are places that aren't home and they aren't work, but places that people can get together and convene with one another. Used to be churches too, but that's not true as much as it used to be. So we started to ask newcomers, why did you move to rural Minnesota? Why did you move to rural Nebraska, Iowa, like all of these places? Why did you move there? And the top 3 reasons people gave for the move was, number 1 was a slower pace of life. Number 2 is safety and security, which is especially high with people with kids. And number 3 was the low cost of housing. Nowhere in the top 5 in Nebraska or top 10 in Minnesota was a job. Now, that doesn't mean people don't get a job. It's just not the exact reason why they made the move to your town. So I want to be careful about this because we tend to have a job-first approach, right? Jobs attract people. But this isn't 1920. Right? It's a chicken or egg. Jobs bring people, or can people bring jobs? Like, it's a well-worn argument at this point. We know it's both today in modern life. People bring jobs with them. 10 to 12% of your workforce right now is working from home. They never walk into your economic development office because they don't need any help. Do you even know they exist? Right? Because they don't need that kind of help. So meanwhile, we have all these newcomers moving in for these reasons. And we ask people like, did you grow up here? Because initially, we thought that like 75% of people moving into your small town were going to be from there. That they had like grown up there, moved away, and then were coming back. But what we found is just 1/3, 36%. 1/3 of your new residents are from there. Let's turn it the other way, like 2/3 of people moving to your rural communities are not from there. And moving is a terribly scary thing anyway, much less moving to a town of 300 people. Or 500 people. Like if you're from there, like it's not to say that people aren't from there, don't have their own baggage, they have their own familial baggage, right? Because then you're like, you grew up there, people can't forget like, hey, I remember when you broke those windows when you were in 3rd grade. You're like, I'm 37. Like, I don't want to think about this, right? But if you're brand new to town and you don't know anybody, and we don't have welcome wagons like we used to because the post office doesn't just hand out a list of all the new people, or for privacy concerns, rightfully so, right? But when we don't have Oldenburg third places, you could be pumping gas next to your new neighbor and you wouldn't even know it. We live in it's starting right now. Like for 6 months out of the year, it's dark when you get up in the morning and dark when you get home. You wouldn't even know if somebody moved in across the street until the spring. You're like, who is that? Like, did John move? Right? So you end up with these situations, you have newcomers moving in and their first year is scary. Who do you go to when you don't know anybody in town if your plumbing bursts at 1 a.m.? Who do you go to when you need emergency daycare? When you have no personal connection to that community, life is a struggle. for a period of time. We know this. We talked to thousands of newcomers. We just got done doing a newcomer survey in Minnesota. We sent out surveys to 20,000 new residents in 20 of our 87 counties to better understand the newcomer experience. And it is a struggle. So meanwhile, we also have these new people in, and we initially thought that a lot of these newcomers were coming in with kids, right? Family-friendly rural communities. What we found is just half of the newcomers move in with kids. That means, you know, if you've got kids, like if there's a new kid in my kids' class, like obviously if they're new into town, there's the new family, right? But every time, they're like the low-hanging fruit. Like I see that family, but every time you find a new family with kids, there's going to be one you might not ever see because they don't have kids. How do they get on your radar? So the point is, people are moving all the time. And I want to use some different language when we talk about movement. But when we talk about movement, like on average, Americans move 12 times. It's 11.7 times during their lifetime. But once you start to hit your 30s, 40s, 50s, your movement rate slows down because you tend to find home. You tend to find a place that fits for what you want in your life. And think about this. It makes sense. Like what, 18-year-olds? When you're 18, you're off to the city, the military, you go to community college, whatever it is. You're trying to find yourself, right? And then it makes sense when you look at these trends in their 30s, like once you hit that 25 age group, you'd have a general idea of what career you want. You may have met a spouse or a partner. You're starting to become more secure in what you want for your life. And then you start taking control over your life. I don't want to sit in a commute for an hour. I'm going to have control over what I do with my day. And I'm going to, for those with kids, spend more time with my kids. So, meanwhile, I want to call this the brain gain, right? We have the brain drain, which is stacks of books and articles talking about the loss of our young people. So I just wanted to counter the narrative to talk about brain gain, and that is the migration of people, mostly in their 30s to 50s, sometimes 50 to 62, but it's not as widespread. And when I first published this in 2002, they're like, wow, this is awesome. I'm glad you found this new trend. I was like, it's not new. This has been happening since the 70s. Since the 70s. Since the year I was born in 1970, there has been nothing but good news for small towns, and we don't know it. And it made me mad. Because there aren't books out there that talk about this. Again, as an academic, I want to see who else is writing about this trend of people moving into rural communities. And what did I find? Almost nothing. Like a footnote or, you know, a little book about rural renaissance, but not really kind of documenting this brain gain and what they bring. But these people are moving in. They're bringing their education, their skills, their life experience. Like imagine this. Imagine what they're bringing. You're calling your town a brain drain town? What are you losing? I'm going to weigh these two out. You're losing an 18-year-old with a high school degree. We're a brain drain town when they decide to leave, without acknowledging you got people in their 30s, 40s, 50s moving in with the college degrees, education, life experience, business acumen. You've got all of these things that start to add up for me to be a brain gain. So we are moving to more of a regional economy in rural life. You see the regional centers, you know where they are today. That's where primary economic growth is. We see high commuting patterns, and we call them mega regions today, that people live in these massive regions. Even the rural economy is much more diverse than ever before. What we found in Minnesota Extension is that, you know, the common thing I would always hear early in my career is like, when I would ask people, like, would you want to move to a rural community? They would say, like, well, I'm not a farmer. I'd be like, well, you don't have to be a farmer, right? You can be anything. What we have found in our economic analysis is that when you start putting together 5 to 7 rural counties, you have the same diversity in occupational interests and industry that you find in the metro. So while not every town is going to have a diverse economy, when you start putting together 3 to 5 to 7 counties, you can be a blank in rural North Dakota. Fill in the blank with whatever job you want. But again, you're not going to find it everywhere. But that is okay, because ultimately, we live in the middle of everywhere. In the middle of everywhere, I would like you to stop using the term middle of nowhere, because it does nobody any good. The middle of everywhere, we document by showing, we do an exercise, an extension that we take a map and you put a star where you live, and then put an X where you work, right? Because we commute out to different towns, you put X's in these different places, where you work, where your spouse works, right? And then draw a circle around. How far do you go out to shop and eat out? Like we go over to the west and we go to the south and not really to the east and way to the north up here. And you end up with this kind of funky shape going out about 45 minutes from your house. And then do the same thing, draw another line around how far do you go out to play. You're like, oh, we go way up here. We go to Winnipeg, and then now we're going over to Duluth a little bit. And then, you've got this huge play area. This is the middle of everywhere. Your house is in the middle of this. And what we find is there's really, there's a 30 or 45 mile radius between live and work and shop and eat out. And now up to 2 to 3 hours out from where you live, where you go to play. How does this now play out when you market your town? So the bottom line here was, mayor, how do you market your town if you don't know what's going on around you? So my point here is, let's say I'm looking to move into Hancock, right? And I run into the mayor on the street. And the mayor is like, you're going to love Hancock. We have a full K-12 school. We have Buddy's Bar and Grill. And we have a C-store / car sales / deli / hairstylist on the corner, right? It's like, this is awesome. I say, yep, it is great. But I'm also looking at moving to Starbuck, which is like 14 miles away, right? And because we're really parochial about all this, you'd be like, the mayor's like, oh, you don't want to move to Starbuck. They got nothing going on there. What did you just do? Not only did you downplay Starbucks, you downplayed yourself. Why do I want to move to your town? You're in the middle of nowhere. You can't name off anything in the radius of your town I might enjoy doing. Do not think towns need to be one-stop shops. I want to remind you all that our jurisdictional boundaries of counties and territories and all these things that we've got were drawn during a time of horse and buggy and do not reflect modern commuting, social transportation life. Transportation people, y'all here, you know this. You already know how big of a region people live in. You've got those, I use the data all the time about how many people are using the road every day, and you can get commuting patterns out of that, all that. It's fascinating from a data guy, I love that data. But it gives you this middle of everywhere picture. So if you don't understand what's going on around you, you're doing a disservice to everybody in your community. So there's implications here in terms of marketing, transportation planning, relationship between housing and a job. Like, I would hear this all the time, like, whoa, we got like 3,000 people commuting into our city every day, into the regional center, right? And the mayor would be like, we got to find a way to get these people to live here. But the point is, like, people don't want to live there all the time. They want to live in the smaller communities. They want to live in the country. Like, we've got it going on in rural America so much to the point, again, we can barely find a house for sale. So, the second piece I want to point to. So that was the migration piece. The next piece is very relevant for North Dakota, even more so, and you'll see why here in a minute. I wanted to look at leadership. My first question was, there's a theme of bowling alone. So those of you that know Robert Putnam's work, he talks about bowling alone, and it's called the decline of social capital in this country, and that, people aren't engaged, and they're not engaged civically, and all these negative pieces about social life in America. And I was like, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense, because when I go to rural communities, I see people like volunteering and engaging like all over the place. I don't believe that's true. So my very first question on this was, how many people do we need to run our town? So this isn't even a big statistical question. This is called bean counting. It's how many people do you need for your city council? How many do you need for your soil and water conservation district? How many do you need for your nonprofit groups? How many people do you need to run your town? Is the basic question here. We're going to look at a supply and demand model for this. Demand is given by organizations. You've got elected and appointed positions on government agencies that need leaders to serve, right? But you've also got this nonprofit sector that demand leaders. So we'll look at this. On the demand side, there's about 90,000 governmental units in the United States. And this includes things like cities, townships, county commissioners, SWCDs, cemetery districts, sewer districts, right? You all know, a lot of you are in government, you know a lot of these positions. These are elected and appointed positions. But at the same time, we've got a really vibrant nonprofit sector. So there's a really awesome database I ran across. Say it with me, awesome database. All right, so there's a really awesome database I ran across from the National Center for Charitable Statistics that gives you data on the number of nonprofits in any county in this country. And the initial data run I ran showed that the number of nonprofits in this country is going up by 10 to 15% every 5 years. This isn't the story of civic decline. You know, it's hard to create a nonprofit. You don't just throw a nonprofit out. You have to find your board. You have to get the articles of incorporation. You hire a lawyer. It costs money. Like, it takes work to create a nonprofit, but the number of nonprofits continues to go up. Here in North Dakota, you would gain 5% in your population from 2000 to 2010. I'll talk about why I'm not going beyond, well, I'll just say it now. So in this data, this goes up to 2010. I don't go beyond that because, and many of you may remember remember this, in 2011, 2012, the IRS said, I don't believe we actually have all 1.6 million nonprofits. Some of these are dead, right? They haven't existed for years. So the IRS sent out a postcard to every nonprofit in the country and said, just return it, okay? Just prove you still exist and return the postcard, right? So there was actually a reduction of like 16% in the number of nonprofits. Well, now if you're a data guy like me, it looks like there's a reduction in the number of nonprofits, but it's not a reduction. It's what I call the Great Cleanse, right? We just cleaned our data up in 2011, 2012, 2013. So these trends are right back on track since then. So even in the most rural counties in North Dakota, the number of nonprofits went up by 6%, where you've lost population. When you look across the country, you're actually on the lower end of nonprofit change, and this confused me a lot at first, and you'll see why. Because I was like, no way in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, do we have some of the lower growth rates in the number of nonprofits. Like, we have strong civic associations. We'll see kind of why in a second. Now let's look at the supply side. People supply leadership for your organizations, for your nonprofit, for your government, elected and appointed position. But we've had diversification in social life too, right? We've changed what we want to do. If this were 1880, the kinds of nonprofit groups and kind of associations you'd find would be like farrier groups dealing with horses, right? Homemaker groups and temperance groups, the anti-sin and vice groups. They were everywhere. And we don't have those anymore, and why not? Because society changes, right? So what we have today, and really, honestly, I love nonprofit groups especially because they reflect who you are. You look at the type of nonprofits you have in your county and in your state, that's who you are. That's because you spend time. Nonprofits don't get dumped into your places. You create them by your people because you have a deep concern for some issue or topic. So we have gone through a change in how people want to be involved, though. Historically, people would be involved in place-based groups with a broad focus. The Hancock Community Betterment Club. Now, it didn't help Starbuck, right? It only helped Hancock, but it did everything, from raising money for the firemen, for the church, or building playground equipment, helping the school, whatever. It didn't matter. Broad focus, narrow geography. Today, people want to be involved in just the opposite. Instead of a broad focus, it's a narrow focus. Instead of a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. The East Central North Dakota Snowmobile Association, right? It's like 7 counties big. It may not even have its home in your county. It may be 2 counties away where the actual incorporation papers are done. But this is how people get involved in social groups today. What types of groups do we see growth in? We see growth in arts, education, recreation, sports, health, wellness. Animal-related. Animal-related is not eagles and lions groups. Those are under mutual benefit, which saw a decline. Animal groups, which actually, retail, anybody in the retail sector and do investments there, they know that the animal-related groups have gone through the roof. And that's like shelter and rescue groups and all animal-related blank has saw just a boon in sales in this country. So anyway, what are the implications here? I wanted to better understand how can we measure this demand for leaders from one county to another. So there's a variable here called population per organizational role. And that is, when you are in charge of a board and you're trying to find members for your board or city council people or county commissioners, how many people in your community does every group have to look to find one person to serve? Here in North Dakota, 1 in 20 people need to serve as a nonprofit or government appointed or elected position leader in your community. This is the highest demand in the country. I thought nonprofits didn't grow that much, right? So what we did is this chart shows population per organizational role in the country. We see now that, you remember the earlier chart showed the nonprofits didn't grow that much, but now you have so many nonprofits per capita, It actually may inhibit growth. Think about this. You want to start a new initiative in a small town? Good luck. I think I've got the map here, and these are hard to see, right? Very northeast, 1 in 12 people, 1 in 13. All the ones in yellow are single digit. 1 in 8 people need to serve as a nonprofit or government leader. 1 in 12 people. And these are very conservative estimates. This is averaging every group needing 3 people. This is a very conservative, I need to redo this, but if in Minnesota, the average nonprofit group has 12 people on its board. Well, if that's true, now some of these groups, it's gonna be 1 in 2 people have to serve as a leader in your community. The implications for this are huge. Not only should you pat yourselves on the back for collective action because you've been working together for decades and you know how to do it, but at the same time, it's very difficult to grow new things when you spend all of your time maintaining the existing social infrastructure. I hope this makes sense. It's one of the more fascinating areas I like to look at. But basically, what happens when new people move into town? Not only do they have like, why would you move here? Like questions, like, okay. But it's like, oh, you're new in town. Hey, you want to sit on our board? Like that is the #1 thing not to do, is to ask people to sit on your board. You actually don't ask them for anything. So anyway, younger people, they've got different approaches to leadership too. If you want to know more about this, I can share more resources with you, or if you're interested in doing a webinar, I can hold that too. Because there's some real depth here to the social engagement side. Oh, by the way, if you want to do this webinar, get a hold of Lynette Flage. She'll hook you up with me to do this. All right, so with that, we call it resident recruitment. How do you welcome new people in to town? This resident recruitment model includes community development, economic development, and tourism. It parallels your traditional industrial recruitment model. Eric Osberg is here. Eric Osberg is from Otter Tail County, Minnesota. Otter Tail County stepped up to the plate and hired the nation's first Rural Rebound Initiative coordinator. Eric is here. He'll be on a panel and a breakout. And we've got groups across the state, in Minnesota at least, that are working on resident recruitment. Everybody has different strategies, because there's not just a well-worn path forward, but we need to do more than just invite people in for a job. Especially in a tight labor market, labor is going to have 3 different jobs available to them. The jobs are all going to look the same. What's going to differentiate one job from another is everything but the job. You have to do more than help people envision their job there. You have to help people envision their life there. And for that, it takes personal, engaged, dedicated community development work. Now, one of the last things I want to leave you with is something I want to say is going to be one of the biggest demographic shifts we've ever witnessed in rural America. And when I say this, you can't say you don't see this coming. 75% of rural homeowners today are baby boomers or older. A subgroup of that are those over the age of 70. It's really age 75 today. 1/3 of your rural homeowners are over the age of 70. Those homes are going to turn over in the next 5 to 7 years. Are you ready to welcome new people in? Do you know where these new people are? How do you even find them when it's dark again? Like you're pumping gas next to your neighbor, you wouldn't even know it. Like we don't have opportunities for social engagement. So, we are going to witness a massive turnover of rural residents. We already know there's demand, right? The brain gain, there's plenty of demand there. But meanwhile, we have seniors that stay in their homes, sometimes I would argue for too long. This is a whole nother presentation. No. The Pew Research Institute did a study a number of years ago that asked Americans, all right, Americans, we know that 80% of you live in the city and 20% of you live in the rural areas and in the country. But if you could choose wherever you wanted to live, where would you want to live? 51% of Americans said they'd prefer to live in small towns and rural places. 51%. Why don't they? I argue they don't believe they ever could, because the narrative about rural is so negative. It's a narrative we use. We use it, we pull it out ourselves at times, right? We have to check our language because it inhibits growth. It inhibits opportunity and action in our rural communities. So really, I like to kind of reframe the whole narrative using migration, because sometimes the best stories about your towns are written by the people who just moved there. Of all the interviews and focus groups I've done, whenever I hear the negative narrative going on, right, well, we should have had or could have had or that closed and we don't have that anymore or we don't have this, well, you want to know how much that plays into the decision making that new residents have? Zero. I have never heard a newcomer defined as people moving the past 5 years. I've never heard a newcomer say they're moving to your town for pity. I feel really bad you lost your grocery store 23 years ago. I'm here to help you out. Nobody ever says this, right? Why do we have the negative narrative? That's not what they want to hear. Especially if they don't know anybody in town. The last thing they want to hear is, like, the town used to be great before. They're like, I love this town for what you are today, right? So, the number one audience for your negative narrative are your kids. These are my kids, Calvin and Truman. They know what the word narrative means, for better or worse. Like, that sure sounds negative, Dad. Like, duh, right? Gotta check your language all the time. Your kids are the number one audience. When your kids repeatedly hear things like you need to get out to succeed, there's nothing here for you, this town was great 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever it was, you need to escape, you're not helping anybody at that point, especially your kids. Because in many ways, we find out that the kids do have a longing to return. But if you tell them there's nothing here for them, they won't be back. So, people are making a choice to move to our rural communities. They're creating groups, they're building their community, they're diversifying your economy, they're buying and starting businesses, some are working from home, they're living in this region, and they're more than warm bodies. The bottom line is, people want to move to your towns for what you are today and will be tomorrow, not what may have been. I truly believe rural revitalization is upon us. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. If you've got any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Let's do that one more time really loud for changing the narrative. Woo! All right, let's practice that before we move on to our next session. So, you know, we're humble people here in North Dakota, and I want to practice just switching that around. We love our state, we love our communities. It's why you're here today. So I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to respond. It's going to be one of those kinds of things. You're going to respond with the word awesome, okay? So it goes like this. Cavalier is, awesome. Right, louder. So Cavalier is, awesome. Beulah is, awesome. Hazen is, awesome. Mayville is, awesome. North Dakota is, awesome. Michelle is. Awesome. Oh, yeah. Just threw that one in there. All right, thanks. Now here's what comes next. We are moving to breakout sessions. We're going to have a session in here. Ben is going to continue with the panel. So please take a break. It is not a break where you engage with your smartphone. It's a break where you engage with each other. So thanks again, and we'll see you in a few minutes.